Chapter 56. Mama Kay stepped into the physicker's shop as Kyler swept the sword up into his hand, but she was too late to stop him. Vi didn't move. She knelt motionless, her shiny red hair pulled out of the sword's path to her neck. The sword descended and bounced off. The shock of the collision rang the sword like a bell. The sword whisked out of Kyler's nerveless grip. "You will not do murder in my shop," Drissa Niles said. Her voice carried such power and her eyes such fire that her diminutive frame might as well have been a giant's. Even though Kyler had to look down to meet her eyes, he was intimidated. "We've accomplished an excellent piece of healing with this woman, and I'll not have you spoil it," Drissa said. "You healed her?" Kyler asked. Vi still hadn't moved. She faced the floor. "From compulsion," Mama Kay said. "Am I right?" "How do you know that?" Trevor asked. "If it happens in my city, I know," Mama Kay said. She turned to Kyler. "The God King bound her with a magic that forced her to obey direct orders." "How convenient," Kyler said. His face contorted as he crushed the tears that were rising. "I don't care. She killed Jarl. I mopped up his blood. I buried him." Mama Kay touched Kyler's arm. "Kyler, Vi and Jarl practically grew up together. Jarl protected her. They were friends, Kyler. The kind of friends that never forget. I don't believe anything less than magic could have compelled her to hurt him. Isn't that right, Vi?" Mama Kay put her hand under Vi's chin and brought her face up. Tears streamed down Vi's face in mute testimony. "What did Durzo teach you, Kyler?" Mama Kay asked. "A wet boy is a knife. Is the guilt the knife's or the hand's?" "Both. And damn Durzo for his lies." There was a knife on Kyler's belt, but he'd already tested its edge. Sister Drissa had blunted it, as he had guessed she might, but she didn't know about the blades up his sleeves, nor could she stop the weapon that were his hands. Vi saw the look in his eyes. She was a wet boy, she knew. He could get a knife out and across her throat in the time it took Drissa to blink. Let the healer try to cure death. Vi's eyes were black with guilt, a mismatch of dark images he couldn't comprehend. A short rush of black figures passed through his mind's eye. Her victims? She'd murdered fewer people than you have. The thought hit him like a shot in the solar plexus. Some guilt, some judge. And the look on her face was all readiness above the tears. There was no self-pity, no avoidance of responsibility. Her eyes spoke for her. "I killed Jarl. I deserve to die. If you kill me, I won't blame you." "Before you decide, you have to know there's more," Vi said. "You were a secondary target after Jarl. I couldn't do it." "Well, that's commendable," Mama Kay said. So I kidnapped Uli to make sure you'd follow me." "You what?" Kyler said. I figured you'd follow me to Sonaria. The God King wants you alive. But Sister Ariel captured me and Uli. When we found you, I thought you were dead. I thought I was free, so I escaped Sister Ariel and came here." "Where's Uli?" On her way to the Chantry. Uli's talented. She's going to be a Maga." It was horrifying, and yet perfect. Uli would be a sister. She'd be taken care of, educated. Kyler had imposed Uli on Elaine. Elaine hadn't chosen to have a daughter who was more the age of a little sister. It wasn't a burden that had been fair for Kyler to ask her to assume. This way, and with the fortune that Kyler had left her, Elaine would be free to have her own life. It was all logical. He had a niggling doubt that he wasn't thinking the way Elaine would think. He could do nothing about that. Finding out that the damage had been minimized, hadn't it? Eased his mind. A sudden fire lit in Mama Kay's eyes at the thought of her daughter being taken to the Chantry, but Kyler couldn't tell whether she was upset that her daughter had been taken, or pleased that her daughter would certainly become a woman of consequence. Either way, Mama Kay quickly smothered it. She wasn't about to let strangers know Uli was her daughter. If he got through this, Kyler would go to the Chantry and see Uli. He wasn't angry that they'd taken her from Vi. If anything, he owed them. And for a girl who was talented, going to the Chantry wasn't really optional. It was supposed to be it's supposed to be dangerous for a child to learn on her own. But if Uli didn't want to stay and they tried to keep her, Kyler would tear down the white seraph around the sisters' ears. But just thinking about Uli made him think about Elaine, and thinking about Elaine threw his emotions into turmoil. So Kyler asked, "Why are you so eager to save Vi?" Mama Kay never worked on just one level. "Because," Mama Kay said, "if you're going to kill the God King, you'll need Vi's help." Say one thing for Kurach, the mages are wrong. It wasn't in the form of a sword for purely symbolic reasons. The son of a bitch could cut. It was a good thing, too. The Cesari were implacable. They weren't called Cesari, old Jadian word for sword lords, for good reason. Nonetheless, Fear was a blade master of the second Echelon. The first clash left 3 of the Syrian warriors dead and gave Fear a short, tough pony. Soon, Fear's height and weight proved a liability again. The pony tired and slowed. In the darkness, Fear let it go. Unfortunately, the little warhorse was trained too well. It stopped and waited for its rider the moment it was released. Fear solved that problem tying a small weave of magic under its saddle that randomly prickled. It would keep the beast running for hours. If he were lucky, the Cesari would lose his trail and follow the horse. He was lucky. It bought him a number of hours on foot. It brought him to the crest of the mountain. He had cut a sapling before he'd hiked above the tree line, and now he was working on the wood with Kurach. The sword had an edge like he couldn't believe, but it wasn't a plane or a chisel. Right now he needed both and a few other tools besides. Dorian once told him about a sport the more suicidal Highlander tribes practice. They called it schluss. It consisted of strapping small sleds to one's feet and going downhill at incredible speeds. Standing, Dorian contended that they could steer, but Fear hadn't figured out how. All he knew was that he had to go faster than the Syrians pursuing him, and there was no way he could build a full sled in the time he had. What he couldn't accomplish with the blade, he accomplished with magic. He was a maker, after all. Wood chips flew as the sun rose. But he had skylined himself like a fool, standing right at the edge of the mountain so that his figure was clearly visible for miles. The Cesari found him before he saw them. They had dismounted and were walking on top of the snow with broad woven bamboo shoes strapped to their feet. The gait they had to assume to keep from tripping over the snowshoes was comical, until Fear realized how fast it let them travel. They would cover in a few minutes what had taken Fear half an hour, lumbering through the snow. He worked faster. He almost forgot to turn up the front tip of each long, narrow sled. He shook his head. He'd caught that mistake. What else had he missed? He didn't have time to fashion proper fasteners, so he wove a web of magic around his shoes and feet and bound them directly to the wood planks. He stood, and immediately caught an edge, and fell. Damn, why'd I square the edges? He should have left them curved like a boat's hull. Standing was embarrassingly difficult. Fear cursed as the Syrians came closer. He was a second Echelon blade master, and he was this clumsy? This was madness. He should have just run downhill. He rolled over onto his butt and finally used the length of the plank to lever himself into a squat. He stood and tried to step forward. The schlusses, which he had smoothed and polished, did exactly what they were supposed to do. They slid back and forth, and Fear barely moved. Fear looked over his shoulder. The Cesari were a bare 100 paces back now. If it came to a fight, the schlusses would doom him. He stumbled, caught an edge, and threw his foot to the side to catch himself. He staggered and slid forward. The joy was as great as he'd felt when he had been named a maker in the Brotherhood. He turned each schluss outward and pushed forward. It worked until he got to the edge and started moving downhill faster than he could step. Each schluss went the way he had pointed it, out. His legs stretched until they could stretch no more, and he pitched forward onto his face. The mountain was steep and the snow mercifully deep. Air was scarce as Fear flipped over and over through the powder. He was dimly aware that he needed to point the schlusses downhill. After 6 or 7 rolls, it happened. Suddenly, Fear burst out of the omnipresent snow. The snow was at least 3 feet deep, but he was on top of it. His heart was a thunder in his chest. He was headed straight downhill at incredible speed. In moments, he was going faster than the fastest horse, and then faster and faster still. controlling the two Schlisses independently was almost impossible, so he quickly lashed them together with magic, both front and back, giving each a little leeway. There were more crashes, and sometimes the snow wasn't as forgiving. Finally, Fear learned how to steer. He steered around a rocky death and looked downhill for the first time, squinting against the white. He blinked. What is that line in the snow? He shot over the precipice. For 2 seconds there was no schlisses of sleds on snow. The world was silent except for the wind blasting in his ears. Then he landed. He crashed through a world of white powder, flipping, arms and legs pulled every which way. Then the miracle happened again, and he popped out of the snow to fly downhill once more. His heart hammered, and he laughed. He had courage. He was safe. The Syrians wouldn't follow him down the mountain. Doing so would put them in scenario. He'd escaped. Incredible, Lantano Gurwashi said. He was a big man for a Syrian. His red hair hung thick and long, with dozens of narrow sections of differently colored hair bound in. In Syria, it was said that you could read a man's life in his hair. At a boy's clan initiation, his head was shaved bald except for one forelock. When the forelock had grown the length of 3 fingers, it was bound with a tiny ring, and the boy declared a man. When he killed his first warrior, the forelock was bound again at the scalp, and he became Ciceran. The shorter the span between the 2 rings on their forelocks, the better. Thereafter, when the Ciceri killed an enemy, he bound the slain man's forelock to his own hair. At first, a few warriors had thought Lentano only had 1 ring, because his first 2 were right on top of each other. He killed his first opponent at 13. In the 17 years since, he'd added 59 locks to his own hair. Had he been born a little higher, all of Syria would have followed him. But a Ciceran's soul was his sword, and nothing could change that. Lentano had been born with an iron sword, a peasant sword. Lentano was a warlord because Syrian tradition allowed any man of excellence to lead armies, but for Lentano it had become a trap. As soon as he stopped fighting, his power ended. He'd begun fighting for Syria's agent, Hideo Watanabe. Then, when the regent ordered him to disband, he became a mercenary instead. Desperate men flocked to his banner for one reason: he never lost. The giant was becoming a speck in the distance. "War Master, do you wish us to follow?" a stump of a man with a score of locks tied in his balding hair asked. "We'll try the caves," Lentano said. "Into Sanaria?" "Just 100 Ciceri. It'll be a cold winter. Killing this giant would give us a tail to keep us warm."